Do you know that a man who was only 20 years old went on to conquer the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen in just 10 years without losing a single battle? Not one. In 10 years of continuous warfare, fighting armies that vastly outnumbered his own, in deserts and mountains and river crossings, from Greece to the borders of India, he never lost. He marched his army over 20,000 miles. He founded more than a dozen cities that still exist today. He overthrew the greatest superpower of the ancient world. He was worshipped as a god in Egypt and honored as a king in Babylon. He reached places that no Greek or Macedonian had ever seen and pushed to the very edge of what he believed was the end of the world. And then he died at 32 years old in a palace in Babylon of a sudden fever, leaving behind the largest empire in history with no plan for what would happen next. His name was Alexander, and to the people he conquered, he was Alexander the Accursed. But to the world that came after him, he became something entirely different. He became Alexander the Great.
The world before Alexander. To understand the scale of what Alexander achieved, we need to understand the world he was born into, and specifically the two powers that defined it. The first was ancient Greece, not a unified nation, but a collection of fiercely independent city-states scattered across a rocky peninsula and the islands of the Aegean Sea. By around 500 BC, these city-states had produced achievements in philosophy, art, drama, mathematics, and political thought that still shape our world today. Athens had given the world democracy, the theater, and some of the greatest philosophical minds in history. Sparta had given the world the most formidable infantry force the ancient Western world had ever produced. In 480 BC, these rival city-states had briefly united to face a common enemy, the Persian Empire's massive invasion of Greece. At the narrow mountain pass of Thermopylae, a small Greek force that included 300 Spartans held the enormous Persian army for 3 critical days before being surrounded and destroyed to the last man. Their sacrifice bought time. The Greek fleet then shattered the Persian navy at Salamis, and the following year at Plataea, a combined Greek army forced the Persians to abandon their invasion entirely. The 50 years that followed were the golden age of classical Greece, the age of Pericles, the age of Socrates, the age of the Parthenon. But the unity that had defeated Persia did not survive the peace. Rising tensions between Athens and Sparta dragged the Greek world into nearly a century of destructive internal warfare that left every city-state exhausted and weakened. And into that exhaustion, from the mountainous north, came Macedonia. For centuries, the sophisticated Greek city-states had looked down on Macedonia as a backward, barely Greek backwater, a kingdom of rough mountain people with no great cities, no philosophy, no drama. But under King Philip II, Alexander's father, Macedonia was about to change the world. Philip II and the making of Alexander. Philip II of Macedon was one of the most consequential rulers in ancient history, a man whose achievements are perpetually overshadowed by those of his son. He transformed Macedonia from a minor regional power into the dominant military force in the Greek world through a combination of military genius, political cunning, and diplomatic skill that his contemporaries consistently underestimated. His most significant military innovation was the sarissa, an 18-foot pike, roughly twice the length of the standard Greek spear, wielded by infantry fighting in the tight formation of the phalanx. A wall of overlapping sarissa tips 16 ranks deep was virtually unstoppable in a direct frontal engagement. Combined with elite cavalry on the flanks, the companion cavalry, armed with spear and sword, Philip had created a weapon system that no contemporary army could reliably defeat.
In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, Philip's army crushed the combined forces of Thebes and Athens, the two most powerful remaining city-states in Greece. The 18-year-old Alexander commanded the Macedonian cavalry in that battle, and his charge broke the famous Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite force of 150 pairs of soldiers bound by personal loyalty, who had never before been defeated in battle. Alexander killed every one of them. Following Chaeronea, Philip united virtually all of Greece, with the significant exception of Sparta, in an alliance called the Hellenic League, with himself as supreme commander. In 336 BC, at his own daughter's wedding celebration, he was assassinated by one of his own bodyguards, a victim of Macedonia's brutal court politics. He was 46 years old. His son, Alexander, was 20. Securing the throne. Alexander's first challenge after inheriting the Macedonian throne was survival. Macedonia's court was a world of constant conspiracy and assassination. His own father had been murdered at his own celebration. Before he could think about Persia, Alexander had to make his position as king unassailable. He moved with extraordinary speed. Potential rivals within Macedonia were eliminated. Rebellions in Illyria, Thessaly, and central Greece were crushed with a military efficiency that shocked those who had assumed a 20-year-old would be easy to challenge. When the ancient city rose in revolt, calculating that Alexander was too young and too distracted to respond, Alexander marched south with his army and destroyed Thebes entirely. The buildings were razed. The population, tens of thousands of people, was sold into slavery. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared. The message to the rest of Greece was received without ambiguity. With Greece under control, Alexander turned his attention east. In the spring of 334 BC, he led his army across the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water separating Europe from Asia, and set foot on Persian soil for the first time. His army numbered approximately 40,000 men, Macedonian phalangites with their 18-foot cuirasses, elite hypaspist infantry, Greek allied hoplites, Thessalian cavalry, the elite companion cavalry, and light troops from Thrace, Illyria, and other regions. It was a carefully balanced combined arms force, and Alexander knew exactly how to use every element of it.
The River Granicus. The Persian satraps, the provincial governors whose territories Alexander now threatened, met to decide their response. A Greek general named Memnon of Rhodes, serving in Persian employ, gave them the strategically sound advice: avoid battle, burn the crops and villages, and let Alexander's army starve before it could find a fight. It was good counsel. They rejected it. Instead, they deployed their cavalry along the far bank of the river Granicus and waited for Alexander to come to them. The Persians had roughly 10,000 cavalry in their front line, with several thousand Greek mercenary infantry held in reserve behind. Alexander's senior commanders advised caution: wait for dawn, cross when visibility was better, plan the operation more carefully. Alexander ignored them all and ordered an immediate assault across the river. What followed was one of the most ferocious opening engagements in ancient military history. Alexander himself led the charge across the river and was almost immediately in mortal danger. Two Persian noblemen attacked him simultaneously, one striking his helmet so hard a piece broke off, the other raising his sword for a killing blow from behind. Alexander was saved only by his cavalry commander, Cletus, who cut off the attacker's sword arm at the shoulder. But Alexander's reckless personal charge was buying precious time for the rest of his army to cross the river, and once the Macedonian phalanx was across and formed up, the Persian cavalry faced that wall of 18-foot pikes and broke.
The Persian Greek mercenaries, who might have changed the outcome, had never had time to engage. They were surrounded and destroyed. At his very first engagement against the Persian Empire, Alexander had won a decisive victory. Asia Minor, modern Turkey, now lay open before him.
The Battle of Issus. After the Granicus, Alexander spent the following months securing the western coast of Asia Minor, taking the coastal cities that served as Persian naval bases, effectively neutralizing the Persian fleet's ability to threaten his supply lines back to Greece. By the spring of 333 BC, he was advancing inland, and then the situation changed dramatically. Darius III, the king of kings himself, had assembled his main field army and moved it to cut off Alexander's line of retreat. The two armies met on the narrow coastal plain near the city of Issus, a battlefield barely 6 miles wide from the mountains to the sea. Darius commanded an army that outnumbered Alexander's by perhaps 2 to 1. His best cavalry were posted on his right flank. His elite Greek mercenary infantry held the center. But the narrow battlefield negated much of the Persian numerical advantage. There simply was not room to deploy the full weight of his forces effectively. Alexander, as always, commanded his own right wing, the side from which he intended to deliver the decisive blow. The battle nearly went wrong in the center. The phalanx, struggling to keep up with Alexander's advance on the right, became disordered and was driven back by Darius's Greek mercenaries. But Alexander, seeing the danger, wheeled his cavalry and drove straight at the Persian center. The mercenaries, suddenly threatened on their flank, collapsed. Alexander fought his way toward Darius himself. And Darius, the king of kings, the ruler of the greatest empire in the world, turned his royal chariot and fled the battlefield. When Darius fled, his army fled with him. Among the spoils of the Macedonian victory were Darius's wife, his mother, and his 3 children, all captured and all treated by Alexander with conspicuous courtesy and respect.
Tyre, Egypt, and Gaugamela. After Issus, Alexander did not immediately pursue Darius. Instead, he turned south, systematically eliminating Persian naval power along the Mediterranean coast. Most of Phoenicia's coastal cities submitted without resistance, but Tyre, the great island city separated from the mainland by half a mile of open sea, refused. What followed was one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements in ancient military history. Alexander ordered his army to build a causeway from the mainland to the island, half a mile of stone and rubble pushed into the sea, protected by siege towers against the Tyrian defenders who attacked it by water. The construction took 7 months. When the causeway reached the city walls and those walls were finally breached, Alexander's patience and engineering genius had overcome what seemed an impossible obstacle. Tyre fell. From Tyre, Alexander continued south through Gaza and into Egypt, where the Persian governor surrendered the entire ancient province without a fight. The priests of Egypt welcomed Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule, and crowned him pharaoh. At the mouth of the Nile, he marked out the boundaries of a new city, Alexandria, which would become one of the greatest centers of learning and culture in the ancient world. But Darius was still alive, still commanding armies, still king of the Persian Empire. In 331 BC, Alexander marched east to find him. The two armies met at Gaugamela, near modern Mosul in northern Iraq, on a wide, flat plain that Darius had deliberately chosen and even had leveled to give his enormous army, estimated at between 50 and 80,000 soldiers, plus war chariots and war elephants, maximum room to maneuver. What Alexander did at Gaugamela was perhaps his greatest military performance. He deliberately marched his right wing out sideways, drawing the Persian left to follow him and thin their center. When the Persian center was sufficiently weakened, he turned and drove straight through it at the head of his companion cavalry, fighting toward Darius himself. Once again, Darius fled. Once again, his army collapsed. The road to Babylon lay open.
The heart of the empire. With Gaugamela I, the great cities of the Persian Empire fell to Alexander in rapid succession. Babylon, the empire's main capital, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the ancient world, opened its gates and welcomed him. Susa surrendered its royal treasury. At Persepolis, the empire's ceremonial capital, Alexander took possession of the accumulated wealth of generations of Persian kings. And then he burned Persepolis. The exact circumstances, and whether it was a deliberate act of policy or the consequence of a drunken celebration that got out of hand, remain debated by historians. Alexander presented it as just retribution for the Persian burning of Athens in 480 BC. As Alexander closed in, Darius was murdered by Bessus, one of his own provincial governors, who then declared himself the new ruler of Persia. Alexander ordered Darius buried with full royal honors in the royal tombs at Persepolis, and then he went after Bessus. Alexander's campaign through the eastern provinces, modern Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, was the hardest and most frustrating of his career. This was not the open field warfare at which he excelled. This was guerrilla war, mountain tribes, sudden ambushes, fortified hilltops, enemies who dissolved into the landscape and reappeared somewhere else entirely. It took 3 years. Bessus was eventually betrayed by his own men and handed over for execution. To the edge of the world. By 327 BCE, Alexander had subdued every province of the former Persian Empire. He had also married Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman, a marriage that was both a genuine personal connection and a sound political act, helping to stabilize the conquered eastern territories. Then he turned his army toward India, the final frontier of what he believed was the edge of the known world. The Indian campaign was Alexander's most costly. At the Battle of the Hydaspes River, fought against the Indian king Porus, who commanded war elephants that the Macedonians had never faced before in battle, Alexander won his most tactically demanding victory. But the casualties were severe, and the psychological impact of the elephants on his men was significant. After the Hydaspes, Alexander wanted to press on, to cross the subcontinent and reach the great river that ancient Greek geographers said formed the edge of the world. His army refused. They had marched over 15,000 miles. They had been fighting continuously for 8 years. They had heard terrifying rumors of even larger armies waiting for them deeper in India. At the river Hyphasis, the modern Beas River in Punjab, Alexander's soldiers staged a mutiny. They would go no further. It was the one battle Alexander did not win. He raged at his men for days. He refused to eat, and eventually he accepted the reality that his army had given him everything it had and could give no more. He turned south, following the rivers of the Punjab to the coast, fighting local tribes along the way, and nearly dying himself during an assault on a fortified city when he was struck by an arrow in the chest. Part of his army sailed home through the Persian Gulf under the command of his admiral Nicarchus, an extraordinary naval voyage through waters previously unknown to Greeks. Alexander led the rest back overland through the Gedrosian Desert in southern Pakistan, one of the most brutal marches in ancient military history, through extreme heat with a catastrophically inadequate food and water, in which a significant portion of his army died not from enemy action, but from thirst and exhaustion.
The return and the costs. Alexander's return to Persia forced a confrontation with the consequences of his decade-long absence. Several of his viceroys and governors had abused their positions, ruling unjustly, pillaging temples, enriching themselves at their subjects' expense. Alexander had them executed. He also had to manage a growing tension within his own court and army, a tension that had been building for years. As Alexander had moved deeper into the former Persian Empire, he had increasingly adopted Persian customs, Persian dress, and Persian court ceremonies. He had integrated Persian nobles into his administration and his army. To his Macedonian veterans, this felt like a betrayal. They had conquered Persia, not become Persians. The tension had already produced tragedy. During a drunken argument in Samarkand, Alexander had killed Clitus, the man who had saved his life at the river Granicus. Clitus had challenged Alexander's growing adoption of Persian ways, and Alexander, in a rage, had run him through with a spear. He spent days afterwards consumed by grief and remorse, but the killing had happened, and it had damaged his relationship with his Macedonian commanders permanently. At Susa, Alexander organized a mass wedding of 80 of his Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen, a deliberate effort to fuse the two cultures of his empire and create a ruling class that would be neither purely Macedonian nor purely Persian, but something new. He married 2 Persian princesses himself. He ordered 30,000 young men from across the empire to be trained in Macedonian military methods. At Opis, his Macedonian veterans mutinied again, offended by his apparent preference for Persian advisors. Alexander had the ringleaders arrested and executed, then delivered a speech to his men that, according to ancient sources, reduced many of them to tears and ended with a genuine emotional reconciliation. But the underlying tension never fully resolved. And then, at Ecbatana, his closest friend in the world, Hephaestion, his companion since childhood, died of fever. Alexander's grief was overwhelming. He went days without food. He ordered a period of mourning across the entire empire. The man who conquered the world grieved like a human being. The death of Alexander. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander returned to Babylon, the city he had chosen as the capital of his vast empire. He was planning his next campaign to Arabia and beyond. Embassies had arrived from peoples across the known world, from Ethiopia, Libya, from the Scythians of Europe, from Gauls and Iberians and Etruscans, all coming to pay their respects to the man who had conquered the world. His Bactrian wife, Roxana, was pregnant with his child and heir. And then, Alexander developed a fever. Ancient sources describe a rapid deterioration over 10 days. He continued to meet with his commanders and plan his campaign, even as his condition worsened. By the time it became clear that he was dying, he had lost the ability to speak. His soldiers, the veterans who had marched with him from Macedonia to India, were allowed to file past his bed to say farewell. Alexander acknowledged each one with his eyes, since he could no longer speak. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. The cause of his death has never been definitively established. Ancient accounts suggest it may have been a fever caused by typhoid, worsened by his earlier chest wound and by the physical punishment of a decade of campaigning.
The aftermath and the legacy. Alexander's death produced exactly the chaos that his failure to name a successor had made inevitable. His generals, men who had served together for a decade, who had conquered the world together, almost immediately began fighting each other for control of the empire. The Wars of the Successors, as historians call them, lasted for nearly 50 years and resulted in the complete fragmentation of everything Alexander had built. His widow, Roxana, and his infant son were murdered. His empire was divided into successor kingdoms, the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in Asia, the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece, each ruled by one of his former generals, each eventually falling to new forces over the following centuries. Even Alexander's own body became a prize in the struggle for legitimacy. His golden sarcophagus, being transported back to Macedonia for burial, was hijacked and diverted to Alexandria in Egypt, where it became one of the great wonders of the ancient world. Its current location is one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries.
But the fragmentation of his political empire tells only part of the story, because what survived the collapse of his conquests was something even more powerful than political control. It was culture. Greek language, Greek art, Greek philosophy, Greek science, the intellectual inheritance of the civilization Alexander had grown up in, spread across the entire territory of his former empire, fusing with local traditions to produce what historians call the Hellenistic Age. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world, was a direct product of Alexander's conquests. The mathematical and scientific advances of Euclid, Archimedes, and Eratosthenes all emerged from the Hellenistic world that Alexander's campaigns created. When Rome eventually absorbed these successor kingdoms, it absorbed the Greek intellectual tradition along with them and transmitted it to medieval Europe, and through medieval Europe to us.
What Alexander tells us. Alexander the Great is one of the most studied and most debated figures in all of human history, and the debate about him has never really settled into comfortable consensus because he defies comfortable consensus. He was a military genius of the very highest order, perhaps the greatest battlefield commander who ever lived. He was also capable of extraordinary cruelty, the destruction of Thebes, the massacre of the Tyrians, the killing of Clitus. He was a man of genuine intellectual curiosity, tutored by Aristotle, who wanted to understand every civilization he encountered. He was also a man of consuming personal ambition, who drove his soldiers to the edge of endurance in pursuit of a vision that only he fully understood. He wanted to be remembered. He succeeded beyond any reasonable measure. More than 2,300 years after his death, his name is known to virtually every educated person on Earth. The cities he founded still exist. The cultural world he created still shapes the civilization we live in. He conquered the known world before the age of 32. He never lost a battle. He left everything unfinished, and he left a mark on history that has never faded. He was 20 years old when he became king. 21 when he crossed into Asia, 32 when he died in Babylon, undefeated, with an empire stretching from Greece to Pakistan and no idea what was supposed to happen next. His soldiers worshipped him, his enemies feared him, the people he conquered sometimes called him the Accursed. The world that came after him called him the Great. 2,300 years later, we are still arguing about whether he deserved that title, which may be the most fitting legacy of all, that he was interesting enough, complex enough, consequential enough to keep us arguing for more than 2 millennia. If this changed how you see the ancient world, share this video with someone who needs to know. Subscribe to Ancient Curiouz and hit the notification bell so you never miss a fact that history forgot to tell you. New episodes every week. I will see you in the next one.